Sarah Cole had always been confident in her abilities, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened on her first day at her new job. Rushing through the sleek, marble-floored corridors of Smith Enterprises, she was distracted, trying to memorize last-minute details about the company. In her haste, she pushed open a door, expecting the ladies' restroom, but instead, she was met with a deep, startled voice. William Smith, the CEO himself, stood frozen by the sink, adjusting his cufflinks. Her heart stopped. RealStory? This was more like a nightmare. For a moment, time seemed to halt. The air between them grew thick with tension as Sarah's brain...
Hello, I'm the storyteller of the channel, and I would like to ask for a second of your time to subscribe, activate the notification bell, and like the video so that YouTube can take our story to more people who are passionate about stories like this. Thank you, and without further ado, let's continue with our story.
Scrambled for an explanation. But before she could mutter a word, William's piercing blue eyes narrowed in cold disapproval. Lost? He asked, his voice dripping with condescension. The room, modern and pristine, suddenly felt suffocating. Sarah wanted to disappear, but instead, she squared her shoulders, willing herself to stay composed. Touching stories of success never start smoothly, do they? The awkwardness only escalated when another executive walked in. A slow smirk spread across his face. Interesting first impression, miss? Sarah stammered, cheeks burning. William simply turned to the mirror, adjusting his tie, pretending she didn't exist. Every inch of her skin prickled with embarrassment. This wasn't just an awkward moment. It was a professional disaster. Her dream job was slipping through her fingers before she'd even started. Desperate to salvage the situation, Sarah forced herself to hold her ground. I was actually looking for the conference room, she lied, voice steady despite her internal panic. William, unimpressed, barely glanced at her. Then I suggest you learn to read the signs, he said coolly, before striding out the door. A hum of laughter followed. It was a brutal beginning, but Sarah wasn't the type to be easily broken. Humiliation clung to her as she finally found the right room. Faces turned as she entered, some amused, some indifferent. Her stomach twisted when she realized William Smith was seated at the head of the table, eyes scanning a document as if she were invisible. But deep down, she knew. He hadn't forgotten that moment. Emotional stories like hers weren't defined by their failures, but by their resilience. As the meeting progressed, she steadied herself. If he thought she was incompetent, she'd prove him wrong. She listened, took notes, and answered with precision. No hesitation, no signs of her earlier humiliation. But William? Every so often, his eyes flickered toward her, as if assessing, measuring. A silent battle had begun. And Sarah? She was more than ready to fight, because at that moment, she decided this would not be the most memorable thing about her career at Smith Enterprises. William Smith was not a man easily impressed. He ruled his company with an iron grip, demanding perfection from everyone, especially from someone who had already made a ridiculous first impression. From the moment Sarah stepped into the office, he threw impossible tasks her way. Late-night reports, back-to-back meetings, last-minute translations, everything designed to push her to the brink. It was a game of survival, and Sarah quickly realized she was the target. But she refused to break. No matter how unreasonable his demands were, she met them head-on. When he asked for a revised contract in 2 hours, she delivered it in 1. When he scheduled her for a meeting in a different language she barely knew, she studied overnight and nailed it. RealStory? This wasn't just work. It was war, and despite himself, William noticed. The tension between them crackled like electricity. Every meeting became a silent battle of wills. He challenged, she countered. He tested, she delivered. And slowly, his cold, unreadable gaze began to change. Admiration flickered beneath the surface, though he would never admit it. It frustrated him. No one had ever stood up to him like this, especially not someone like Sarah. Late one evening, she caught him watching her. Not in a way that suggested criticism, but something else, something unexpected. For the first time, his usual stoic mask slipped, if only for a second. Why did it bother him so much that she was succeeding? Why did it matter that she was different? His frustration was palpable, but Sarah, for once, had the upper hand. The more he tried to shake her, the more unshakable she became. Employees started whispering about how she handled the impossible without flinching. Some even admired her. But for Sarah, it wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about proving to herself that she belonged here. No mistake, no CEO, no impossible challenge would drive her away. One evening, exhausted but victorious, she left William's office after a particularly brutal workday. As she walked away, she heard him sigh, a rare, weary sound. A flicker of something unreadable passed between them when their eyes met. He was losing the battle he had started, and deep down he knew it. But neither of them were ready to admit what was really happening. Not yet. The air between them had changed. It was subtle at first, glances that lingered too long, silences that felt heavier than words. Sarah pretended not to notice, but deep down, she knew. Real story? This wasn't just a professional rivalry anymore. Something else was pulling them closer, whether they wanted it or not. And that terrified William. One evening, after an exhausting meeting, Sarah stepped onto the company's rooftop balcony, needing air. She didn't expect to find William there, staring at the city skyline, lost in thought. For the first time, he looked human. Not the ruthless CEO, not the untouchable businessman, just a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she spoke. "You ever just wish you could disappear for a while?" she asked, half joking. To her surprise, he let out a quiet chuckle. "More than you think." The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. In that moment, the walls they had built began to crack. Because for the first time, they weren't boss and employee. They were just two people trying to figure things out. But reality crashed back, and soon enough. A week later, an elevator incident brought them dangerously close, literally. A sudden power outage left them trapped, just the two of them in the small space. The tension was suffocating. In the dim emergency lighting, their eyes met. No corporate meetings, no challenges, no pretenses. Just a charged silence that neither of them dared to break. Sarah's pulse raced. William was close, too close. His usual cold demeanor was gone, replaced by something else. Something dangerous. "This is a terrible idea," he muttered under his breath, as if trying to convince himself. But neither of them moved. It was as if the universe itself had forced them into this moment, demanding they stop running from whatever this was. The elevator hummed back to life, breaking the spell. The door slid open, and just like that, the moment was gone. William was the first to step out, his mask slipping back into place. Sarah followed, her heart still pounding. Neither of them spoke about what had just happened, but they both knew things had changed. And no matter how hard they tried to ignore it, there was no going back. The shift between them had become impossible to ignore. William felt it every time Sarah walked into a room, an undeniable pull that unsettled him. And that was the problem. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. He was the CEO, she was his employee. Lines had to be drawn, rules had to be followed. So, he did what he did best. He pushed her away. Cold, distant, ruthless. He drowned himself in work, barely acknowledging her presence. Meetings were strictly professional. No stolen glances, no accidental brushes of hands. And when Sarah, exhausted from the constant back and forth, submitted her resignation, he didn't stop her. He simply approved it, his signature sealing the distance between them. Touching stories never come without heartbreak, do they? Sarah was furious, hurt. She had given everything to this job, to proving herself, and now, just when she thought she had earned her place, he was letting her go without a fight. Maybe she had been foolish to believe there was something more. Maybe she had imagined it all. With her resignation letter accepted, she booked a flight and made peace with the fact that this chapter was over. But William? He was a wreck. He sat in his office, staring at the signed resignation, feeling an unfamiliar ache in his chest. For the first time in years, he couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. The idea of her being gone, really gone, was unbearable. He had made a mistake, a terrible one, and if he didn't fix it now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. The realization hit him like a freight train. He bolted from his chair, ignoring the confused stares of his employees as he rushed out of the building. The airport, that was where she would be, and he had to stop her before it was too late. His heart pounded as he sped through the city, weaving through traffic, fueled by something he had spent years denying. Fear, desperation, love. Sarah sat at the gate, her hands clenched around her boarding pass. She told herself she wasn't waiting for him, that she didn't care. But when she heard her name echo through the terminal, her heart stopped. William stood there, breathless, disheveled, eyes burning with something raw. And then, in front of everyone, he did the one thing she never expected. He said it, out loud, for the world to hear, that he was sorry, that he was an idiot, But he didn't get to finish because Sarah was already moving toward him, already making the choice her heart had made long ago. And just like that, the war between them was over. William had never been the kind of man to wear his heart on his sleeve, but standing there in that airport, holding Sarah like she was the most precious thing in the world, he knew he had changed. And it wasn't because of some grand revelation. It was because of her, because she had challenged him, fought him, stood her ground. And somehow, in the chaos of it all, she had become the one thing he couldn't live without. Their return to the company was met with whispers, amused glances, and the occasional knowing smirk. The ruthless CEO and the woman who had once walked into the wrong bathroom. Who would have thought? But Sarah, ever composed, met it all with a quiet smile. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone anymore. She had already won the only battle that mattered. Months passed, and the shift in William was undeniable. The once untouchable businessman now left meetings early just to have dinner with Sarah. The man who never showed emotion now had a way of looking at her that made even his coldest employees believe in love. Real story? He was still William Smith, still sharp, still demanding. But now he was also hers. Then came the moment neither of them expected. A simple morning, a routine day, until Sarah stood in front of him, holding a pregnancy test with trembling hands. Positive. For the first time in his life, William was speechless. A father. The idea terrified him. But when he looked at Sarah, he knew he wasn't in this alone. Their wedding was small, intimate, nothing like the grand corporate affairs William was used to attending. But it was perfect, because when Sarah walked down the aisle, radiant, confident, unapologetically herself, he knew this was the best decision he had ever made. She had walked into his life by accident, but she had stayed by choice. And now, she was his future. Months later, in a quiet hospital room, William held their newborn daughter in his arms. The once imposing CEO, the man who had built walls around his heart, now sat in awe of something far greater than himself. His family, his home, his reason. And as Sarah looked at him, exhausted but smiling, she whispered, "Still think I don't belong in your world?" William chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Sarah," he murmured, voice thick with emotion, "you are my world."